They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was just another currency to be traded. My name is Elena, and for 15 years, I was the invisible engine behind Vortex Systems, the billion-dollar tech giant in Seattle. I wrote the code, I built the security, and I stayed in the shadows while my husband, Gavin, took the spotlight as the charismatic CEO. I thought we were partners. I thought we were building a legacy. I was wrong. It all ended on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home early from a medical appointment to find Gavin's car in the driveway next to a convertible I recognized instantly. It belonged to my younger sister, Chloe. Walking into the master bedroom, I didn't just find an affair, I found a conspiracy. They weren't panicked. They were annoyed that I had interrupted them. Gavin didn't apologize. Instead, he reached into his nightstand and pulled out a legal folder. He told me he had been waiting for the right moment. He handed me papers that stripped me of my shares, my home, and my dignity, citing a clause in our contract I had never seen before. He told me I was too old, too boring, and that Chloe was the face Vortex needed now. He gave me 1 hour to pack a bag and leave. He looked at me with a smirk and said that without him, I was just a middle-aged woman with a laptop. I walked out the front door, leaving behind my marriage, my sister, and my life's work. He thought he had broken me, but Gavin forgot one crucial detail. He might own the company, but I hold the keys to the system. The rain in Seattle wasn't just falling, it was hammering against the windshield, a relentless assault that matched the chaos screaming inside Elena's head. She had been driving for 2 hours without a destination, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The fuel light blinked, a mocking red eye on the dashboard. She pulled into a dilapidated gas station off the interstate, her hands trembling as she slid her platinum card into the reader. Declined. She stared at the screen, rain soaking her blouse instantly. She tried the backup card, the one for emergencies. Declined. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She fumbled for her phone, water dripping from her hair onto the screen, and opened her banking app. The Face ID spun for a second before a red banner flashed across the display. Access revoked. It wasn't just the joint account. It was everything. Her personal savings, her investment portfolio, even the emergency fund she had set aside for Leo's college. Zero access. Gavin hadn't just left her. He had initiated a scorched earth protocol, freezing every asset within 60 minutes of her walking out the door. A notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. An email from the Human Resources Department of Vortex Systems. The subject line made her breath hitch. Termination of employment. Immediate effect. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, picking out the phrases that felt like physical blows. Gross misconduct. Serious violation of data security protocols. It was a fabrication so bold it left her dizzy. They were firing her from the company she had co-founded, the company she had built from a basement startup into a tech giant, accusing her of stealing the very data she had spent 15 years protecting. She dug through her purse, her fingers scraping against the bottom until she found a crumpled wad of cash. $82. That was her net worth right now. 30 minutes later, she sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in the Starlight Motel. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and mildew. Outside, the roar of 18-wheelers thundering down the highway shook the thin walls every few minutes. Elena felt small, displaced. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating against the cheap laminate of the nightstand. It was a message from Gavin's lawyer. It was a wall of text threatening a countersuit for defamation and emotional distress, warning her that if she did not comply quietly, they would petition for a restraining order that would complicate her relationship with Leo. Leo. She tapped the message app, desperate to hear her son's voice, to hear him say this was insane. There was a new message from him, delivered 3 minutes ago. Mom, please stop making things hard for Dad. Chloe understands me better than you do anyway. You only ever cared about making me study. Let everyone just be happy for once. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the carpet with a dull thud. That message shattered what was left of her resolve. She curled onto her side, pulling her knees to her chest, ignoring the dampness of the bedspread. Memories flashed like a fever dream. She remembered the nights she stayed awake for 20 hours straight, eyes burning as she wrote the foundational code for Vortex, surviving on stale coffee and adrenaline. She remembered missing school plays because the server crashed. She remembered building the empire while Gavin was out networking, drinking expensive scotch, and charming investors with technical buzzwords he barely understood. He was the face. She was the spine. And now he had ripped the spine out. She lay there for an hour, the tears drying on her cheeks, leaving her skin tight and salty. The trucks rumbled outside. Slowly, the crushing weight of despair began to shift. It grew heavier, harder, transforming from grief into something cold and solid. Anger. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her erased. They wanted to scrub 15 years of her sweat and intellect from the history of Vortex systems. Elena sat up. The movement was stiff, mechanical. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window. Gavin was a shark in the boardroom. Yes. He knew how to leverage a hostile takeover and how to charm the board of directors, but Gavin did not know code. He thought cloud architecture was just a buzzword to sell to venture capitalists. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. He had forgotten that before she was a wife, before she was a mother, and before she was a victim, she was the architect. She reached into her bag and pulled out her backup laptop. It was an old, battered machine, heavy and scarred, but it had a localized Linux drive that never touched the company cloud. Elena wiped the last tear from her jawline. She opened the lid, the screen illuminating her face in the dark motel room. Gavin controlled the accounts, the lawyers, and the narrative. But he had forgotten that she was the one who wrote Hydra, the company's central security protocol. He had the keys to the front door, but he didn't know she had built a trapdoor into the foundation. She cracked her knuckles. She would not sleep tonight. The counterattack began now. The hum of the laptop fan was the only sound competing with the rain hammering the roof. But in Elena's mind, the voices of the past were screaming louder than the storm. She stared at the command line blinking on her screen. But what she saw was her childhood bedroom. It had always been this way. She was the useful one, the draft horse pulling the cart, while Chloe was the show pony. Chloe was beautiful, charming, and fragile, the perennial princess who needed protecting. Elena remembered the day she came home with a full scholarship to Stanford. Her mother, Patricia, had not cried with joy. She had sighed with relief, not because Elena was safe, but because the family savings could now be diverted to pay off Chloe's credit card debt. $7,000 of designer clothes and handbags, wiped clean by Elena's hard work. Her mother had held her hand and said that she was the strong one, that her sister needed help, and that family always supported family. Family. The word tasted like ash in her mouth now. Then came Gavin. He had swept in like a savior, handsome and ambitious. But looking back, Elena saw the predator behind the smile. He had not fallen for her laugh or her kindness. He had fallen for her algorithm. He saw a woman who could build the future, a cash cow he could ride all the way to the bank. While she spent the early years of their marriage hunched over a keyboard, correcting kernel panics at 3 a.m, Gavin was the face of the company, and Chloe was always there, hovering. Elena remembered the business trips Gavin took to Las Vegas and Miami for trade shows. He would say that he was taking Chloe as an assistant because she needed the experience and Elena was too valuable on the back end to leave the office. God, she had been so blind. She had handed Gavin the keys to the kingdom, the checkbook, the legal authority, the administrative rights, just so she could focus on the purity of the code. She thought she was being efficient. In reality, she was digging her own grave. Elena blinked, snapping back to the damp motel room. The self-pity vanished, replaced by the cold, hard logic of a systems architect. Her fingers flew across the keys of the battered laptop. They thought locking her out of the admin panel was enough. They thought revoking her credentials meant she was powerless. But they forgot that Hydra was her creation. Before she released the final version of the security system 5 years ago, she had embedded a kernel-level backdoor. It was a ghost key, undetectable by standard audits, designed for exactly this kind of catastrophic lockout. She hit enter. Access granted. The screen flooded with data. She was not just looking at the front end, she was inside the nervous system of Vortex systems. She bypassed the user logs and tapped directly into the internal server traffic. She initiated a silent download of the executive email archives and the internal security camera footage. The progress bar crawled forward as terabytes of betrayal siphoned onto her encrypted drive. She started digging through Gavin's private directory. It did not take long. He was arrogant, and arrogance made people sloppy. She found a hidden folder titled Project Paradise. Inside were deed transfers and bank wires. She saw the numbers, and her stomach churned. Over $2 million siphoned from company accounts in the last 18 months, channeled into offshore holding companies registered to Patricia and Chloe. She opened the payroll subfiles. There it was, in black and white. Chloe was listed as a senior strategic consultant. Her salary was $20,000 a month. $20,000 for 3 years. Chloe had not stepped foot in the office since the launch party. While Elena was denying herself a salary increase to keep the research budget healthy, her sister was bleeding the company dry. But the final document was the one that turned her blood to ice. It was a draft agreement for a merger and acquisition. Gavin was not just stealing, he was selling out. He was cooking the books, inflating the quarterly revenue by 30% to court a massive buyout from a rival conglomerate. The timeline was clear. The sale was scheduled to close in 2 weeks. He needed Elena gone because she was the only one who would spot the financial discrepancies during the due diligence phase. He was going to sell her life's work, take the payout, and leave her with nothing but a ruined reputation. Elena sat back, the glow of the screen illuminating the tear tracks on her face. They thought she was defeated. They thought she was just a sad, middle-aged woman crying in a cheap motel. They had no idea she was currently holding the detonator to their entire world. For 3 days, Elena became a ghost in room 204 of the Starlight Motel. She lived on vending machine coffee and protein bars, her eyes locked onto the glowing screen of her old laptop. The digital trail Gavin left behind was arrogant and messy. He had assumed no one would look, certainly not his wife, who he believed was technologically illiterate regarding financial forensics. She found the loans first. There were 3 separate bank loans totaling $4 million, all secured against her personal assets, and every single document bore a digital signature that looked exactly like hers. But the timestamps on the metadata proved she had been in a mandatory compliance seminar in San Francisco when 2 of those signatures were created. He had forged them, but the rage did not truly take over until she followed the money laundering trail. She uncovered a shell company named L Squared Holdings. It was registered in the Cayman Islands, used to funnel the stolen funds out of Vortex. When she checked the registration documents, her blood ran cold. The sole director and beneficiary listed was Leo. Gavin had set up their 19-year-old son as the fall guy. If the IRS or the SEC ever audited this, Gavin would claim ignorance, and Leo would be the one facing federal prison time for tax evasion and money laundering. Elena closed the laptop. The time for crying was over. She needed a weapon, and she needed an ally who hated Gavin as much as she did. Julian Black came to mind immediately. 5 years ago, he had been the frontrunner for a massive government defense contract. Gavin had sabotaged him by leaking false rumors about Julian's solvency, causing his stock to tank just before the bid closed. Vortex won the contract, and Julian's company nearly went under. She bought a burner phone from the gas station next door. She dialed the number she had dug up from the archives. Julian answered on the second ring. She kept it brief. She told him she had the original unredacted bid files from 5 years ago proving Gavin's sabotage, and she had current proof of massive corporate fraud at Vortex. Julian was silent for a moment before giving her an address. They met 2 hours later in a dimly lit jazz bar in downtown Seattle. Julian Black looked older, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp. He reviewed the flash drive she slid across the table. When he looked up, there was a predatory grin on his face. He agreed to the terms immediately. He would provide her with a top-tier legal team and physical security. In exchange, when the dust settled and Vortex collapsed, he would buy the assets for pennies on the dollar. Elena's only condition was that the intellectual property rights to the Hydra system would return to her. The trap was set in the divorce settlement. Julian's lawyers drafted a document that looked like a total capitulation. It gave Gavin everything. The house, the cars, the majority shares of the company, and full custody of the joint assets. It painted Elena as a broken woman walking away to save her sanity. However, buried deep in the addendums, on page 42, subsection C, was a microscopic clause known in legal circles as a poison pill. The clause stated simply that if either signing party was convicted of a felony or found liable for financial fraud within 12 months of the signing, the entire transfer of assets would be rendered null and void, and full ownership would revert to the other party, along with punitive damages. The meeting to sign the papers took place in the glass-walled conference room of Gavin's expensive law firm. Elena played her part perfectly. She wore no makeup, her eyes were red-rimmed, and she hunched her shoulders to look smaller. She trembled as she picked up the pen. Gavin sat across from her, flanked by Chloe, who was wearing a diamond bracelet that Elena recognized as one bought with company funds. Gavin's lawyer, a man who cost $800 an hour, was too busy smirking at his easy victory to read the fine print of the appendix. He had scanned the main headers, saw that his client got everything, and assumed Elena's legal team was incompetent. Elena sniffled loudly. She asked if they could just get this over with because she wanted to move to her mother's house in the countryside. Gavin laughed, a short, cruel sound. He told her she was pathetic and that she should have stayed in the kitchen where she belonged. He grabbed the pen and signed his name with a flourish, not even glancing at page 42. Chloe signed as a witness, beaming with triumph. They had just signed their own death warrants. Elena signed her name slowly, her hand shaking for dramatic effect. As she walked out of the office, leaving the papers on the mahogany table, the tears instantly stopped. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and finally allowed herself to smile. The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry before the invitations went out. Gavin and Chloe did not just plan a wedding, they orchestrated a coronation. They rented the most exclusive ballroom in downtown Seattle, a venue that cost $50,000 just to unlock the doors. It was billed as a dual celebration, the union of two soulmates and the impending sale of Vortex Systems to a global conglomerate. To the outside world, they were the golden couple, victorious and untouchable. They moved through the crowd of city officials and tech moguls, clinking crystal glasses filled with vintage champagne, blissfully unaware that they were dancing on a trapdoor. Patricia was in her element. She posted photos to social media every hour, captions dripping with sycophancy. She praised Gavin as the son she never had and gushed about Chloe's beauty, calling her a woman of true class. In the comments section, she made passive-aggressive remarks about how refreshing it was to finally have positive energy in the family, subtly painting Elena as a bitter, incompetent failure who had never known how to appreciate a good man. Meanwhile, Leo was invisible to them. He sat in his room, or what was left of it, bathed in the blue light of his monitors, with the supplementary platinum card Gavin had tossed at him to keep him quiet. Leo was burning through cash at a terrifying rate. He was betting $3,000 a hand on online poker, chasing losses with the reckless abandon of a boy who had been taught that consequences were for poor people. He had not attended a university lecture in 2 weeks. Elena saw it all. Her access to the smart home security system was still active. a blind spot Gavin had missed in his arrogance. She sat in her cramped rental, watching the grainy feed as Chloe instructed the housekeepers to clear out the master closet. She watched as her clothes, her books, and her engineering journals were stuffed into black garbage bags and dragged to the curb like common trash. It did not hurt anymore. It just fueled the cold fire in her gut. The following morning, Gavin held a press conference to announce the new era of Vortex. He stood on a podium, flashing his whitened teeth, and took credit for 15 years of Elena's innovation. He spoke about the Hydra security protocol as if he had written it himself, using buzzwords that made no technical sense. Back at the office, however, the reality was fracturing. The servers were throwing up critical error flags. Without Elena's daily maintenance, the load balancing was failing. When the IT lead panicked and told Gavin the system was unstable, Gavin waved a dismissive hand and ordered them to patch it with a temporary fix. He told them to just make it look pretty for the due diligence team and that they would worry about the architecture after the check cleared. Elena decided it was time to light the fuse. She compiled the final dossier, a dense packet of evidence documenting the bid rigging, the tax evasion, and the fraudulent loan applications. She sent it anonymously to the local field office of the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission, with a specific note attached. She requested that they execute their warrants on Saturday evening, right in the middle of the wedding reception. Just then, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a junior developer at Vortex, one of the few who had remained loyal to her. The message was short and urgent. It said that Gavin had scheduled a wire transfer of the company's entire liquid cash reserves to an account in the Cayman Islands for Monday morning. He was planning to hollow out the company before the buyers realized they had purchased an empty shell. Elena stood up and walked to the closet. Hanging there was her armor for the final act. It was not the gray, sensible suits she had worn for decades to make herself invisible. It was a sharp, tailored white suit, pristine and commanding. It was the color of mourning in some cultures, but for her, it was the color of rebirth. Her phone rang again. This time it was Julian. His voice was low and satisfied. He told her that the paperwork was finalized. He had successfully purchased Gavin's distressed debt from the banks. As of 10 minutes ago, Julian Black was not just a competitor. He was the primary creditor of Vortex Systems. He held the lien on everything Gavin thought he owned. Elena smiled, a terrifyingly calm expression. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the curtain was about to fall. 2 days before the wedding, Elena tracked Leo down. It was not difficult. Gavin had given the boy a black credit card, but he had not taught him how to disable the location tracking on his smartphone. Leo was at a high-end club in the Capitol Hill district, a place where the music was too loud and the drinks cost $30 a glass. He was surrounded by a group of loud friends, his arm draped over a sofa, looking bleary-eyed and arrogant. When he saw his mother walking through the haze of the strobe lights, his expression curdled. It was a mix of shame and annoyance. He stood up, swaying slightly, and tried to block her path. He told her to leave immediately because she was embarrassing him in front of his crew. Elena did not raise her voice. She remained calm, her face an unreadable mask. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin manila folder. She handed it to him, opening it to the page where his signature was stamped next to the incorporation papers of a shell company. She explained to him, clearly and coldly, that his father was using him. She told him that Gavin had set him up as the legal owner of a company used to launder money, and that when the federal investigation hit, Leo would be the one facing prison time, not Gavin. She was offering him a way out, a chance to denounce the signature before the authorities stepped in. Leo did not even look at the papers. He slapped the folder out of her hand, sending the documents scattering across the sticky floor. He shouted over the thumping bass, his face twisted with a cruel sneer. He told her that she was just jealous. He said she could not stand the fact that his father gave him money and power while she had never given him anything but pressure to study and lectures about responsibility. Then came the words that severed the final thread. He looked her in the eye and told her that she was the past. He said that Aunt Chloe was a better mother because she understood him and let everyone be happy. He told Elena to get out of his life and never show her face to him again. Elena looked at her son. For a second, she felt the crushing weight of a heart breaking, the physical pain of rejection from the child she had raised. But as the echo of his words faded, the pain was replaced by a strange, cold lightness. She had done her duty. She had offered the lifeboat. He had chosen to drown. She realized then that she could not save someone who did not want to be saved. She was absolved of her guilt. She turned around and walked out of the club without looking back. As soon as she reached the quiet of the street, she pulled out her burner phone. She typed a message to Julian. It was 3 sentences. No more exceptions. The boy is part of the collateral. Proceed as planned. The next morning, her phone rang again. It was Patricia. Her mother was not calling to extend an olive branch. She was calling to issue a warning. Patricia told her that if she dared to show up and ruin Gavin and Chloe's special day, there were security guards hired specifically to keep her out. She told Elena to have some dignity for once in her life. Elena listened to the venom in her mother's voice and felt nothing. She let out a short, dry laugh. She told Patricia not to worry, because she would certainly not be attending the wedding as a guest. She hung up before her mother could ask what that meant. Elena spent the final night before the reckoning in her motel room. She did not sleep. She sat before her laptop, running the final diagnostics on a script she had written. It was a program designed to override the audio-visual systems of the hotel ballroom where the reception was being held. She checked the timing, the audio levels, and the sequence of the files. Everything was green. She was ready to crash the party, not with her physical presence, but with the truth. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic was a sea of silk, diamonds, and imported orchids. It was the wedding of the year, a spectacle designed to signal power and stability to the nervous shareholders of Vortex Systems. Gavin stood at the head table, looking dapper in a bespoke tuxedo, holding Chloe's hand. On her finger sat a diamond ring that had cost $150,000, paid for directly from the company's research and development budget. The crowd of 300 guests, the elite of Seattle society, applauded politely as the couple exchanged kisses under the soft glow of the chandeliers. Gavin tapped his microphone, silencing the room. He began his speech, his voice thick with practiced emotion. He spoke about true love, about finding his soulmate, and about how family was the bedrock of his success. He raised his glass to toast the future, a future he claimed would be built on integrity and trust. Precisely at that moment, the massive LED screen behind the main stage, which had been cycling through a montage of romantic engagement photos, emitted a deafening screech of static. The image of Gavin and Chloe kissing on a yacht dissolved into digital noise. The guests gasped, murmuring in confusion. A second later, the screen went black, only to reignite in a harsh, blood-red glow. Giant letters scrolled across the display. The truth about Vortex Systems. Below it was the logo of a snake eating its own tail. Before Gavin could react, the screen shifted. It became a dashboard of damnation. Copies of emails flashed by, dated 3 years prior, detailing illicit hotel meetups between Gavin and Chloe while Elena was in the hospital recovering from surgery. Then came the bank statements. They were magnified for everyone to see, highlighting transfers of $50,000, $20,000, and $10,000, moving from the corporate accounts to personal offshore holdings. "Turn it off," Gavin screamed, his face turning a shade of purple. He gestured frantically to the tech booth at the back of the room. "Cut the power now!" But the technicians were helpless. Their consoles were locked out. Suddenly, the speakers crackled, and a voice filled the cavernous room. It was not the DJ. It was Elena. Her voice was crystal clear, calm, and terrifyingly professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the screen, you will see a transfer dated October 14th. Elena's voice narrated, treating the exposure like a quarterly financial review. This transaction of $80,000 was labeled as server maintenance. As you can see from the receipt on the right, it was actually used to purchase the vintage Aston Martin the groom drove here today. The crowd erupted into chaos. Phones were out, recording everything. And here, Elena continued, the screen shifting to a grainy security camera feed, is a meeting between Gavin and his mother-in-law, Patricia, who had been sitting at the front table beaming with pride, froze. The video showed her sitting in Gavin's office, accepting a thick envelope. The audio from the recording played clearly over the speakers. Gavin's voice said that it was $50,000 to keep her mouth shut about the affair. Patricia's voice replied that she always knew Chloe was the better fit for him anyway. A collective gasp went through the room. Patricia clutched her chest, her face draining of color, and collapsed into her chair, covering her face with a napkin as the other guests recoiled from her in disgust. "It is a lie!" Chloe shrieked, grabbing the microphone Gavin had dropped. She stood there in her $50,000 gown, tears streaking her makeup. "We are innocent." "She is hacking us. Is she?" Elena's voice cut through. "The documents currently on screen show the shell company L Squared Holdings. The sole signatory for the laundering of $2 million is you. Chloe, you are not just a mistress. You are an accomplice to federal wire fraud." The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a bang that silenced the room. Elena walked in. She was not the frumpy, tired engineer they remembered. She wore a sharp white suit that seemed to glow under the house lights. She walked with a predator's grace, flanked by Julian Black and 4 large men in dark suits. Gavin's private security team took one step forward, saw Julian, and immediately stepped back. They knew better than to intervene in a corporate war of this magnitude. Elena walked straight down the center aisle, the crowd parting for her like the Red Sea. She stopped 10 feet from the stage, looking up at the trio of ruins, Gavin trembling with rage, Chloe sobbing, and Patricia cowering in shame. The room was deadly silent. Elena looked at Gavin, her expression devoid of anger, devoid of love, holding only icy contempt. "You wanted a wedding that Seattle would never forget," Elena said, her voice unamplified but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have given it to you." The silence that followed Elena's declaration was shattered not by applause, but by the heavy, authoritative thud of boots hitting the marble floor. The double doors at the entrance did not open for a wedding cake or a champagne tower. They were thrown wide by a dozen agents wearing windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI and local law enforcement officers. The coordination was precise, the timing impeccable. Agents swarmed the head table. Gavin, who had been purple with rage only seconds ago, went pale as 2 officers ascended the stairs. He tried to stammer a protest, mentioning his lawyers and his status, but the officers were unimpressed. They spun him around, pressing his face into the white tablecloth he had chosen for its high thread count. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the stunned room. An agent read his rights loud enough for the back row to hear, listing charges of securities fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds, and multiple counts of bank fraud. Chloe was next. She stood frozen, clutching her bouquet as if it were a shield. When the female officer took her arm, the reality of her situation pierced through her vanity. She did not act with dignity. She began to wail, a shrill, desperate sound. She pointed a manicured finger at her new husband, screaming that she knew nothing, that Gavin had forced her to sign the papers, and that she was just a victim. Gavin, pinned against the table, did not defend her. He twisted his neck to glare at Elena, spitting accusations and blaming her for ruining his life, ignoring the woman he had just vowed to protect. Patricia scrambled through the chaos, her heels clicking frantically on the floor as she rushed toward Elena. She grabbed Elena's arm, her eyes wide with panic. She pleaded with Elena to stop this, invoking the sanctity of family and the bond of blood. She begged Elena to call off the police, as if Elena had the power to stop a federal investigation. Elena looked at her mother's hand on her sleeve, then looked up at her face. It was the face of a stranger. Elena calmly removed her mother's hand and stepped back, offering no words, only a look of absolute indifference. In the corner of the room, the party was over for Leo. A detective approached the 19-year-old, holding a clipboard. He did not arrest the boy, but he handed him a court summons. The detective explained that as the sole owner of the shell company used to launder the stolen assets, Leo was a person of interest and was barred from leaving the state. The color drained from Leo's face. He looked across the chaotic ballroom, locking eyes with his mother. His lips moved, forming the word, Mom. It was a plea for salvation, a beg for her to fix it like she had fixed his homework and his mistakes for his entire life. Elena held his gaze for a heartbeat. Her heart ached, a sharp, physical pain. But she remembered his words from the club. She remembered the disdain. She shook her head slowly. Once. She had offered him a lifeline 2 days ago, and he had slapped it away. Now, he had to learn to swim. The guests were fleeing the ballroom, hiding their faces from the press photographers who had somehow slipped in behind the police. Julian Black stepped into the center of the room, flanked by his legal team. He raised his voice, announcing that as the primary holder of Vortex Systems' distressed debt, and in light of the criminal indictments against the current CEO, he was initiating an immediate foreclosure on the company's assets. At that moment, the trap Elena had set in the divorce papers snapped shut. The poison pill clause was triggered automatically by the formal filing of federal criminal charges. The transfer of assets was rendered null and void due to material breach of contract. Legal ownership of the marital assets, including the voting shares of Vortex, reverted immediately to Elena. Elena did not hesitate. Julian's lawyer presented her with a pre-prepared document on a clipboard. It was a transfer of authority. She signed her name with a steady hand, exchanging the toxicity of Vortex and the burden of its scandal for a substantial cash payout and preferred stock in Julian's holding company. She was selling the wreckage to the only man ruthless enough to salvage it. She capped her pen and handed the clipboard back, without a word to Gavin, who was being dragged out the side exit, or to Chloe, who was hyperventilating in a chair. Elena turned her back on them. She walked down the center aisle, past the overturned chairs and the ruined flowers. She pushed through the doors and stepped out of the hotel. The cool night air of Seattle hit her face, smelling of rain and exhaust. But to her, it smelled like absolute freedom. She took a deep breath, hailed a taxi, and did not look back. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. It took the jury less than 4 hours to deliberate on the mountain of evidence Elena had provided. Gavin was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge, disgusted by the sheer scale of the embezzlement and the manipulation of family members, ensured there was no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Every asset Gavin possessed, from the waterfront property to his collection of vintage watches, was seized by the government to pay restitution to the defrauded investors. He was led away not in a luxury sedan, but in a transport van with caged windows, screaming that he was a victim until the heavy steel doors slammed shut. Chloe fared little better. Her defense that she was merely a naive spouse crumbled under the weight of the digital signatures on the laundering accounts. She was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and money laundering. Prison was cruel to a woman whose self-worth was entirely tied to her appearance. Stripped of her expensive dermatological treatments and designer wardrobe, the stress aged her rapidly. The internet, once her playground, turned on her with vicious delight. Memes of her weeping in her orange jumpsuit circulated on social media, turning her tragedy into a global punchline. Patricia avoided a prison cell, but she could not escape the financial ruin. With Gavin's accounts frozen and the monthly allowance cut off, the walls closed in. She was forced to sell her home at a significant loss to pay for Chloe's defense team, only to watch her daughter go to jail anyway. Destitute and alienated from her social circle, she was moved into a state-subsidized nursing home on the outskirts of the city. It was a gray, cheerless place that smelled of antiseptic and boiled cabbage, a far cry from the country club lifestyle she had clung to so desperately. Leo managed to avoid prison time. His lawyer successfully argued that he was a pawn under the coercive control of his father, and his testimony against Gavin had been crucial. He received 5 years of probation, but the collateral damage was severe. The university rescinded his acceptance letter immediately, citing their strict code of conduct regarding criminal proceedings. With a felony record attached to his name, his career options evaporated. The boy who had once bragged about spending $3,000 on a night out was now scrubbing grease off plates in the back of a 24-hour diner to make rent for a basement apartment. Elena's phone still rang occasionally with collect calls from the correctional facility or numbers associated with the nursing home. She never answered. Letters arrived, written on cheap-lined paper, stained with tears, begging for forgiveness or, more often, for money. She returned them all unopened. She had severed the gangrenous limb, and she had no intention of stitching it back on. Instead, Elena took the substantial capital she received from the sale of Vortex to Julian Black and channeled it into a new purpose. She founded a venture capital firm dedicated exclusively to funding female engineers and founders who had been overlooked by the traditional tech giants. She named it Hydra Ventures, a nod to the code that saved her. 6 months later, the bank foreclosed on the mansion she and Gavin had once shared. Elena bought it back at the auction. She did not move in. Instead, she hired a demolition crew. She stood on the sidewalk and watched as the bulldozer tore through the master bedroom, bringing the symbol of her oppression crashing down in a cloud of dust and drywall. On that land, she commissioned the construction of a state-of-the-art shelter and job training center for women escaping domestic financial abuse. She saw Leo only once more. She went to the diner where he worked late one Tuesday night. He looked up from the sink, his hands red and chapped from the hot water and harsh soap. When he saw her standing there in her tailored coat, he froze. Shame washed over his face, and he looked down, mumbling a quiet apology that was barely audible over the clatter of dishes. Elena did not say a word. She simply placed a crisp $100 bill on the counter as a tip and walked out. The business magazines called her the Phoenix of Silicon Valley, the woman who rose from the ashes of betrayal to build an empire of her own. But as Elena sat in her new office, looking out over the rain-slicked city skyline, she knew the truth. The best revenge had not been the destruction of her enemies. It was the realization that she could live a full, vibrant, and successful life without them. They had destroyed themselves with their own greed. She was simply the one who turned on the lights so the world could see it. 1 year had passed since the night the truth shattered the ceiling of the Fairmont Olympic Ballroom. Elena stood in the corner office of her new company, Aura Tech, pressing her hand against the cool floor-to-ceiling glass. The Seattle sky, so often a suffocating blanket of gray wool, was a brilliant, piercing blue today. Sunlight flooded the room, illuminating the sleek, modern furniture and the bustling, open-plan workspace below. There were no dark corners here. There was no rain to hide the tears. Reports from the outside world still reached her, though she no longer sought them out. News traveled through the legal grapevine that Gavin was not faring well in federal prison. His arrogance, once his armor in the boardroom, had become a liability in the cell block. Rumors suggested he had been severely beaten in the yard after trying to talk down to a shot caller, leaving him broken and terrified. Chloe was reportedly living her own version of hell, isolated by the other female inmates who despised her vanity and entitlement. Their lives had become small, dark cages of their own making, stripped of the glamour they had traded their souls to possess. Elena turned away from the window. Julian Black sat on the sofa reviewing a portfolio, but the dynamic had shifted. He was a trusted partner now, an ally in business, but he was not her savior. She had saved herself. The burning anger that had fueled her for months had finally evaporated, leaving behind a deep, resonant peace. She no longer woke up with a racing heart. She no longer felt the phantom weight of Gavin's criticism on her shoulders. Her computer chimed with a notification. It was an email from Leo. It was long, rambling, and devoid of the entitlement that had once defined him. He wrote that he had registered for classes at the local community college, majoring in computer science. He attached a receipt showing that he had paid the tuition himself using the wages he earned washing dishes. The final line of the email made Elena pause. He wrote that losing everything was the hardest lesson he ever learned, but it was the only one that actually taught him anything. He thanked her for letting him fall. Elena typed a reply. She did not offer money. She did not offer to rescue him from his small apartment. She typed 5 words. Keep trying. I am watching. It was a sliver of hope, a distant promise that perhaps, years from now, when he had built his own character, there might be a table for him at her house, but not today. She picked up a small, framed photograph from her desk. It was an old picture of the 3 of them, Gavin, a young Leo, and herself taken 15 years ago. For a long time, she had kept it as a reminder of what she had lost. Now, she realized it was just a picture of strangers. With a calm, deliberate motion, she slid the photo out of the frame and tore it down the middle. She dropped the pieces into the recycling bin. The sound of the paper hitting the metal bottom was the final note of a long, painful song. Elena smoothed the lapels of her jacket and walked out of her office. In the conference room, a dozen bright young engineers looked up expectantly. They were not looking at a victim. They were not looking at an ex-wife. They were looking at Elena, the founder, the visionary, the woman who had clawed her way out of the grave to build a tower. She took her place at the head of the table. She realized then that she was no longer defined by the betrayal. She was the architect of her own reality. She cleared her throat, her voice projecting with a power that commanded the room. She told them that when you hold the source code to your own life, no one can delete you. No one can overwrite your existence. She looked at the team, her eyes shining with the fire of a woman who had walked through hell and came out holding a torch. They stole my past, but they accidentally gave me a brilliant future they can never touch. Thank you so much for listening to this story of resilience and justice. We would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below, sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more listeners.